The purpose of this video is to provide information on following best practices for installing vCenter Server 5.5. This is not a comprehensive guide. For more information, see the vSphere 5.5 documentation. The documentation contains definitive information. If there is a discrepancy between the guide and this article, assume that the documentation is correct. Note that because each environment is different, many installation decisions require knowledge and understanding beyond the scope of this video. For more detailed information about your installation, see the vSphere Installation and Setup Guide and review the vSphere 5.5 release notes for known issues or special installation notes. vSphere 5.1 introduced the vCenter Single Sign-On component as part of the vCenter Server Management Infrastructure. This change affects vCenter Server installation. Authentication by vCenter Single Sign-On makes the VMware Cloud Management Infrastructure platform more secure by allowing the vSphere software components to communicate with each other through a secure token exchange mechanism. For more information about single sign-on deployment modes, see the vCenter Single Sign-On Deployment Modes section in the vSphere Installation and Setup Guide. During the first installation of vCenter Server, you must install all components. One single sign-on server can serve your entire vSphere environment. After installing Single Sign-On Server once, you can connect all new vCenter Server instances to the same Single Sign-On Server service. You must install an inventory service instance for each vCenter Server instance. The Simple Install option installs vCenter Single Sign-On, the vSphere Web Client, vCenter Inventory Service, and vCenter Server on the same host or virtual machine. Simple Install is appropriate for most deployments. For guidance on the Simple Install, see the knowledge base article, Methods of Installing vCenter Server 5.5. If you want to customize the location and setup of each component, you can install the components separately by performing a custom install and selecting the individual installation options in this order: vCenter Single Sign-On, vSphere Web Client, vCenter Inventory Service, then vCenter Server. You can install each component on a different host or virtual machine. If you decide on installing multiple vCenter Server systems, you can point to the same vCenter Single Sign-On service for each vCenter server. For more information, see the knowledge base article, Methods of Installing vCenter Server 5.5. Unlike vCenter Single Sign-On 5.1, the Single Sign-On service included in vSphere 5.5 synchronizes authentication data across locations. The following section consists of the hardware requirements for vSphere 5.5. Pause the video to read the detailed descriptions. Note that the vCenter server system is a physical machine or virtual machine with access to a supported database. The vCenter server system must meet specific requirements. The minimum requirements for simple install, deployment of vCenter Single Sign-On, the vSphere Web Client, vCenter Inventory Service, and vCenter Server. The minimum hardware requirements for vCenter Single Sign-On running on a separate host machine from vCenter Server. The minimum hardware requirements for vCenter Inventory Service running on a separate machine from vCenter Server. The minimum hardware requirements for vCenter Server. If you're installing vCenter Single Sign-On, vCenter Inventory Service, and vCenter Server on the same host machine, ensure that you meet the additional vCenter Single Sign-On and Inventory Service memory and disk storage requirements mentioned below. Note that installing vCenter Server on a network drive or USB flash drive is not supported. For the hardware requirements of your database, see your database documentation. The database requirements are in addition to the vCenter Server requirements. if the database and vCenter server run on the same machine. The JVM Heap Settings for vCenter server. The number of hosts and powered-on virtual machines in your environment affect the performance. The following section provides the system requirements as minimum guidelines for reasonable performance. Processing requirements are listed in terms of hardware CPU cores. Only physical cores are counted. In hyper-threaded systems, logical CPUs do not count as separate cores. It's important to note that recommended disk sizes assume default log levels. If you configure more detailed log levels, more disk space is required. The hardware requirements for the vSphere Web Client server component. Note that the vSphere Web Client has two components, a Java server and an Adobe Flex client application running in a browser. The hardware requirements for VMware vCenter Server Appliance. The JVM Heap Settings for VMware vCenter Server Appliance. Ensure that your operating system supports vCenter Server. vCenter Server requires a 64-bit operating system, and the 64-bit system DSN is required for vCenter Server to connect to its database. For a list of supported operating systems, see the VMware Compatibility Guide. vCenter Server requires the Microsoft.NET 3.5 SP1 framework. If this is not installed on your system, the vCenter Server installer installs it. The .NET 3.5 SP1 installation might require internet connectivity to download more files. Some additional notes on vCenter Server software requirements. If your vCenter Server host machine uses a non-English operating system, install both the Microsoft.NET Framework 3.5 SP1 and Microsoft.NET Framework 3.5 Language Pack through the Windows Update. Windows Update automatically selects the correct localized version for your operating system. The .NET Framework installed through the vCenter Server installer includes only the English version. vCenter Server 5.5 removes support for Windows Server 2003 as a host operating system. For more information, see the VMware Compatibility Guide. vCenter Server 5.5 removes support for Windows Server 2008 SP1 as a host operating system. Upgrade Windows Server 2008 SP1 host to SP2 before upgrading vCenter Server to version 5.5. For more information, see the VMware Compatibility Guide and the Microsoft Software Lifecycle Policy. If you plan to use the Microsoft SQL Server 2008 R2 Express database that is bundled with vCenter Server, Microsoft Windows Installer version 4.5 is required on your system. You can download MSI 4.5 from the Microsoft website. You can also install MSI 4.5 directly from the vCenter Server autorun.exe installer. The VMware vCenter Server Appliance can only be deployed only on hosts that are running ESX version 4.x or ESXi version 4.x or later. Before installing vCenter Single Sign-On, Inventory Service, and vCenter Server, review the prerequisites. Review the release notes for known issues or special installation notes. For more information, see the VMware vSphere 5.5 release notes. Gather the information that the vCenter Single Sign-On, Inventory Service, and vCenter Server installation wizards require. For more information, see the required information for installing or upgrading vCenter Single Sign-On, Inventory Service, vCenter Server, and the vSphere Web Client section in the vSphere Upgrade Guide. Decide whether the vCenter Server instance will be a standalone instance or in a linked mode group. For more information, see the Creating vCenter Server Linked Mode Groups section in the vSphere Installation and Setup Guide. Download the vCenter Server Installer from the VMware website. Verify that your system meets the requirements previously shown in this video. Ensure that the required ports are open. For related information, see the knowledge base article, Required Ports for vCenter Server 5.5. Before you install or upgrade any vSphere product, synchronize the clocks of all machines on the vSphere network. For more information, see the Synchronizing Clocks on the vSphere Network section in the vSphere Installation and Setup Guide. Verify that the DNS name of the vCenter Server host machine matches the actual computer name. Verify that the host name of the machine that you're installing vCenter Server on complies with the RFC 952 guidelines. The installation path of vCenter Server must be compatible with the installation requirements for Microsoft Active Directory application mode. The installation path cannot contain non-ASCII characters, commas, periods, exclamation points, pound signs, @ signs, or percentage signs. Verify that the system on which you are installing vCenter Server is not an Active Directory domain controller. On each system that is running vCenter Server, verify that the domain user account has these permissions. Member of the administrators group, acts as part of the operating system, log on as a service. vCenter Server requires the Microsoft.NET 3.5 SP1 framework. If it is not installed in your system, the vCenter Server installer will install it. The .NET 3.5 SP1 installation might require internet connectivity to download more files. If the system that you use for your vCenter Server installation belongs to a workgroup rather than a domain, not all functionality is available to vCenter Server. If assigned to a workgroup, the vCenter Server system is not able to discover all domains and systems available on the network when you use some features. Your machine must be connected to a domain if you want to add Active Directory identity sources after the installation. To determine whether the system belongs to a workgroup or a domain, right-click My Computer, click Properties, and click the Computer Name tab. The Computer Name tab displays either a workgroup label or a domain label. Verify that the Network Service account has read permission on the folder in which vCenter Server is installed and on the HKLM registry. During the installation, verify that the connection between the machine and the domain controller is working. Before installing vCenter Server in the Administrative Tools control panel on the single sign-on instance to which you plan to register vCenter Server, verify that the following services are started. You must log in as a member of the administrators group on the host machine with a username that does not contain any non-ASCII characters. Verify that the fully qualified domain name on the system where you want to install a vCenter Server is resolvable by running the following command in the command prompt. If the fully qualified domain name is resolvable, the nslookup command returns the IP and name of the domain controller machine. Verify that DNS reverse lookup returns a fully qualified domain name when queried with the IP address of the vCenter Server. When you install vCenter Server, the installation of the web server component that supports the vSphere web client fails if the installer cannot look up the fully qualified domain name of the vCenter Server from its IP address. Reverse lookup is implemented using PTR records. Verify that no network address translation exists between the vCenter Server system and the hosts it will manage. Install vCenter Server like any other network server on a machine with a fixed IP address and a well-known DNS name, so that clients can reliably access the server. Assign a static IP address and host name to the Windows server that hosts the vCenter Server system. This IP address must have a valid internal domain name system registration. Ensure that the vCenter Server has a valid DNS resolution from all ESXi hosts and all vSphere web clients. If you use DHCP instead of a static IP address for vCenter Server, make sure that the vCenter Server computer name is updated in the domain name service. Ping that computer name to test this connection. For example, if the computer name is host1.company.com, Run the following command in the Windows command prompt. If you can ping the computer name, the name is updated in DNS. If you want to use Active Directory as an identity source, verify that it is set up correctly. The DNS of the single sign-on server host machine must contain both lookup and reverse lookup entries for the domain controller of the Active Directory. For example, pinging mycompany.com should return the domain controller IP address for my company. Similarly, the ping-a command for the IP address should return the domain controller hostname. Avoid correcting name resolution issues by editing the host files. Instead, make sure that the DNS server is correctly set up. For more information about configuring Active Directory, see the Microsoft website. Verify that your vCenter server database meets the database requirements. For more information, see the vCenter Server Database Configuration Notes and Preparing vCenter Server Databases sections in the vSphere Installation and Setup Guide. Create a vCenter Server database, unless you plan to install the bundled database. Ensure that the vCenter Server database is a supported version and is not set to compatibility mode with an unsupported version. For more information, see the following guide. vCenter Server 5.1 and 5.5 use Single Sign-On Server for authentication. For a list of supported identity sources with Single Sign-On Server 5.1, see the vSphere 5.1 documentation. Single Sign-On Server 5.5 supports the following types of user repositories as identity sources, but supports only one default identity source. Active Directory versions 2003 and later. Single sign-on allows you to specify a single Active Directory domain as an identity source. The domain can have child domains or be a forest root domain. This is shown as Active Directory Integrated Windows Authentication in the vSphere web client. Active Directory over LDAP. Single sign-on supports multiple Active Directory over LDAP identity sources. This identity source type is included for compatibility with the single sign-on service included with vSphere 5.1. This is shown as Active Directory as an LDAP server in the vSphere web client. Open LDAP versions 2.4 and later. Single sign-on supports multiple Open LDAP identity sources. This is shown as Open LDAP in the vSphere web client. Local operating system users. Local operating system users are local to the operating system where the single sign-on server is running. The local operating system identity source exists only in the basic single sign-on server deployments and is not available in deployments with multiple single sign-on server instances. Only one local operating system identity source is allowed. This is shown as local OS in the vSphere web client. vCenter Single Sign-On System Users. Exactly one system identity source named vSphere.local is created when you install Single Sign-On. This is shown as vSphere.local in the vSphere web client. You can use the Microsoft Windows built-in system account or a user account to run vCenter Server. With a user account, you can enable Windows authentication for SQL Server, and it provides more security. The user account must be an administrator on the local machine. In the installation wizard, you specify the account name as domain/username. You must configure the SQL Server database to allow the domain account access to the SQL Server. The Microsoft Windows built-in system account has more permissions and rights on the server than the vCenter server system needs, which can contribute to security problems. For SQL Server DSNs configured with Windows Authentication, use the same user account for the VMware Virtual Center Management Web Services service and the DSN user. If you do not plan to use Microsoft Windows Authentication for SQL Server, or you are using an Oracle database, you might still want to set up a local user account for the vCenter server system. The only requirement is that the user account is an administrator on the local machine. vCenter Server 5.1 and 5.5 supports connection between vCenter Server and vCenter Server components by IP address only if the IP address is IPv4 compliant. To connect to the vCenter Server system in an IPv6 environment, you must use the fully qualified domain name or host name of the vCenter server. The best practice is to use the fully qualified domain name, which works in all cases, instead of the IP address, which can change if assigned by DHCP. For more information, view the article this video is based on, or any of the following knowledge base articles related to 5.5. Thank you for choosing VMware. By clicking on the annotations below, you can follow the Support Insider blog for updates and alerts from the VMware support team, view more videos on VMware and VMware products at the KB2052334 channel on YouTube, or follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest updates, alerts, and VMware support.